The Atlantic Wall was not merely a defensive line, it was a statement of iron and concrete, a sprawling, malevolent architecture stretching from the fjords of Norway to the beaches of France. By the summer of 1944, its most terrifying teeth were not the machine gun nests or the barbed wire, but the massive, reinforced concrete bunkers known as the heavy naval gun batteries. And among these, one name sent a chill through Allied planning rooms: the Myris battery on the French coast, and its even more formidable cousin, a labyrinthine complex burrowed into the cliffs at Cap Blanc-Nez. These were not mere fortifications, they were fortresses, designed to house colossal guns capable of hurling shells the size of a small car across the English Channel, making the vital shipping lanes and the very ports of southern England a shooting gallery. They were, for all intents and purposes, invulnerable. Conventional bombing runs by the RAF and USAF had proven futile. The bombs of Lancasters and flying fortresses simply bounced off the meters-thick concrete roofs or exploded harmlessly against the angled, steel-reinforced walls. The damage was cosmetic, the German engineers merely shrugging and ordering repairs. The guns, the true threat, remained untouched, a constant, looming presence that dictated Allied strategy and haunted the dreams of invasion planners. The D-Day landings had succeeded, but the fight for the French coast was far from over. The supply lines feeding the Allied advance were perilously vulnerable to the wrath of these concrete behemoths. Something had to be done. A new kind of weapon was needed. Not a bigger bomb, but a more precise one. A weapon of such cataclysmic, localized force that it could, in a single, earth-shattering moment, not just damage, but utterly annihilate a target previously thought to be indestructible. The problem was delivered to the desks of the most unconventional thinkers in the Allied arsenal. The solution they proposed was as brilliant as it was horrifying. If a bomber couldn't drop a bomb big enough to destroy the bunker, then the bomber itself would become the bomb. This was not to be a suicide mission in the Japanese sense, that was a cultural and tactical anathema to the Western Allies. This would be something new, something born of American engineering and desperation. They would take the war-weary, the veterans of 100 missions who were now considered expendable, and they would give them a final, posthumous duty. They would create a drone. A remote-controlled, pilotless aircraft, packed with more high explosives than had ever been flown in a single package. They would call it Operation Aphrodite, after the Greek goddess of love and beauty, a stark, ironic contrast to the ugly, brutal reality of the weapon they were about to birth. The aircraft chosen for this macabre transformation was the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, the very symbol of American daytime strategic bombing. But these would not be the proud, gleaming ships that flew in tight formations over Germany. These would be the war-weary B-17s that had been chewed up by flak, riddled with bullet holes, their engines coughing, their airframe strained to the limit by countless missions. They were planes that had given their all, and were now destined for the scrap yard. Or, as the Aphrodite planners saw it, they were the perfect raw material. At airfields in England, a secret and grim process began. Teams of engineers and armorers swarmed over these battered giants. Every piece of non-essential equipment was stripped out. The guns, the turrets, the oxygen systems, the radio gear, the seats, all of it was torn away, leaving a cavernous, skeletal shell. The goal was simple: reduce weight to an absolute minimum to make room for the payload. And what a payload it was! The chosen explosive was Torpex, an alloy of TNT, RDX, and aluminum powder, 50% more powerful than TNT alone. It was a dense, brown, putty-like substance, and they packed it into the gutted fuselage. Not in bombs, but in blocks, stacked from the cockpit to the tail, turning the aircraft into a single, massive, flying bomb. The final load was an almost unimaginable 20,000 pounds, 10 tons, of high explosive. This was more than the entire bomb load of a full squadron of B-17s on a standard mission. This was the weight of a fully loaded truck, suspended in a fragile aluminum shell. To detonate this monstrous charge, they designed a complex, redundant system of fuses. The primary was a twin solenoid system, triggered by the immense G-forces of impact. The backup was a simple, crude, and terrifyingly final barometric fuse, set to detonate the entire mass if the aircraft descended below a certain altitude. There was no single point of failure. The moment this aircraft hit its target, or even came close, it was designed to vaporize itself and everything around it in a fireball of biblical proportions. But how to deliver it? A pilot could not be expected to take off, aim this 10-ton bomb, and then die in the blast. The solution was a two-man crew, a volunteer pilot and flight engineer, who would perform the takeoff and initial climb. Their cockpit was a scene of surreal modification. They sat not in a standard flight deck, but in a makeshift cabin, the walls lined with the raw, exposed blocks of Torpex. They were, quite literally, sitting on their own coffin. Behind them, a second cockpit had been installed, a primitive and experimental remote control system. Once the drone was airborne and stable, the two-man crew would arm the deadly payload, switch the controls to radio command, and then perform the most dangerous part of the entire mission. They would bail out. AB-17 was not designed for a pilot to bail out in flight, especially not one laden with 10 tons of explosives. It was a desperate, one-way gamble. If they succeeded, Mothership, a following aircraft, would then take control via a radio link, guiding the now pilotless, bomb-laden fortress on its final, deadly glide towards the impregnable German bunker. It was a plan born of equal parts genius and desperation. On paper, it was a work of brutal, elegant engineering. In reality, it was a pact with physics and fate that would demand a terrible price. The air at RAF Fur's Field in Norfolk crackled with a tense, experimental energy in the summer of 1944. This was the secret stage for Operation Aphrodite, a place hidden from standard operational records, where the rules of aerial combat were being rewritten into something far more sinister. The first of these converted drones, AB-17 designated for a shakedown flight, sat on the tarmac, a grotesque parody of the proud fortress it once was. Its fuselage, swollen with Torpex, seemed to strain against its own skin. The volunteers for this first mission were U.S. Navy Lieutenant Joseph P. Kennedy, Jr., the eldest son of the former Ambassador Joseph P. Kennedy, and his co-pilot, Lieutenant Wilford John. Kennedy was a figure of immense pressure and expectation, golden-haired, ambitious, and seen as a future political star. He had volunteered for the mission seeking a combat record that would eclipse his father's controversial legacy. The weight of his name was as palpable as the 10 tons of explosives he was about to sit upon. The mission profile was deceptively simple: take off, climb to 2,000 feet, arm the explosives, set the radio control, and bail out over the North Sea, where a high-speed naval vessel would pick them up. A mothership, a specially modified B-24 Liberator, would then take control and fly the drone out to sea for a safe, remote detonation, testing the system's viability. On August 12, 1944, Kennedy and John strapped themselves into the sparse, Torpex-lined cockpit of the drone, nicknamed Zoot Suit Black. The engines coughed to life, the sound a dull roar against the quiet English countryside. The takeoff was heavy, sluggish, the overweight bomber lumbering into the sky. Observers on the ground watched with bated breath as the aircraft, a flying bomb of unprecedented power, climbed slowly, its fate and that of its crew now in the hands of untested technology. The mothership, with its crew of radio operators and observers, followed at a safe distance, its operators ready to take control. The first phase proceeded nominally. Kennedy radioed that they were proceeding with the arming sequence. This was the most critical and dangerous part of the entire operation. The arming process was not a single switch, but a complex series of steps to activate the twin solenoid fuses. Inside the shuddering, noisy cockpit, Kennedy and John began the checklist. They were flying a bomb, and they were now making it live. What happened next remains a subject of analysis and grim speculation. The official investigation would later suggest a catastrophic electrical fault. It is believed that as they completed the final step of the arming sequence, a short circuit in the poorly shielded, makeshift wiring sent a stray voltage directly into the firing mechanism for the Torpex. In that instant, the 10-ton explosive charge was triggered. There was no warning, no mayday call. One moment, Zoot Suit Black was a struggling aircraft climbing over the English village of Blythburgh. The next, it vanished in an apocalyptic, silent flash that was seen for miles. The sound that followed was not a bang, but a deep, percussive thump that hit the chests of observers on the ground. The B-17, Kennedy, John, and its colossal bomb load, were instantaneously vaporized. The force of the explosion was so immense that it was initially mistaken for a V-1 rocket impact. Debris from the aircraft was scattered over a 2-mile area. The mothership, miles away, was violently shaken by the blast wave. There was nothing left to recover, no remains to identify. Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. had been erased from existence in a fraction of a second, a victim of the very weapon he was meant to control. The shockwave from the explosion was not just physical. It reverberated through the highest levels of Allied command. The secret was now a tragedy. The loss of a figure as prominent as Kennedy was a devastating public relations blow, but the military implications were worse. Operation Aphrodite was flawed at its very core. The technology was too crude, the margin for error non-existent. The volunteers were not just risking their lives, they were sitting inside the detonator of the largest bomb ever built, with wiring that could kill them at any moment. The disaster forced an immediate stand-down and a frantic re-evaluation. Engineers scrambled to understand the fault. The wiring was improved, and new safety protocols were theoretically put in place. But the fundamental, terrifying vulnerability remained: the crew had to arm the bomb while they were still inside it. There was no way around this fatal flaw. The pressure to neutralize the German bunkers, however, was unrelenting. The Allies were bogged down in Normandy, and the threat from the heavy gun batteries was a strategic constant. Just over a week after the Kennedy disaster, the operation was greenlit once more. The targets were the hardened U-boat pens at Heligoland, a concrete fortress that had repelled every conventional attack. The Americans, undeterred by catastrophe, were prepared to try again. The nightmare of Aphrodite was not over, it had only just begun. The silence that fell over RAF Furs Field in the wake of the Kennedy explosion was heavier than any fog. It was a silence laden with shock, grief, and the cold, hard fear of engineers who now knew the specter they were dealing with. For a brief, tense period, Operation Aphrodite was frozen. Ground crews looked at the remaining, war-weary B-17s with a new, superstitious dread. These were not just machines anymore, they were unstable, 20,000-pound high-voltage traps, waiting to be armed. The investigation into the catastrophe pointed squarely at the crude, rushed electrical systems. The wiring, jury-rigged and running perilously close to the live firing circuits, was a death sentence. In the hangars, engineers worked under the dim, swinging lights, their faces grim. They rerouted cables, added new shielding, installed extra circuit breakers, and designed what they hoped were foolproof safety switches. It was a race against time and fear, an attempt to build a better detonator for a flying bomb that no one truly wanted to fly. Yet, the strategic imperative had not changed. From Supreme Headquarters, the orders were clear and urgent. The German U-boat pens at Heligoland and the massive concrete fortifications along the French coast were still operational, still threatening Allied shipping and lives. The conventional air forces had failed to destroy them. Aphrodite, for all its horrific risks, remained the only card to play. And so, less than 2 weeks after the first disaster, the operation was reluctantly resumed. The mood was no longer one of experimental optimism, but of grim, fatalistic determination. The next volunteer crews were briefed with a new, chilling level of candor. They were shown the revised schematics, walked through the precise sequence of the improved arming procedure, and left with no illusions about the consequences of a single mistake. They were not just test pilots, they were bomb disposal experts, and the bomb they were disarming was the cockpit around them. The first of these new missions targeted the U-boat pens at Heligoland, a complex of reinforced concrete so thick it represented the zenith of defensive architecture. On August 27, a converted B-17 drone, its fuselage packed tight with Torpex, lumbered into the sky from Fur's Field. The two-man crew, their hearts pounding in their chests, performed the delicate ballet of arming the beast. Every click of a switch, every flick of a lever was done with meticulous, sweat-soaked care. This time, the electricity behaved. The system armed. With a shared look of sheer relief, they activated the radio control, set the autopilot, and prepared for their escape. Bailing out of a B-17 in flight was a perilous maneuver under the best circumstances. Doing so from an aircraft that was essentially a massive, primed bomb required a nerve of steel. They jettisoned the cockpit canopy, the wind screaming into the cabin. One after the other, they hurled themselves into the void, the drone flying on, a ghost ship heading out over the North Sea. The mothership moved in, its operators taking control. They guided the drone towards Heligoland. But the technology, even when it worked, was infuriatingly imprecise. The radio control link was prone to interference and had a limited range. The video feed from the drone's nose camera was grainy and unstable. As the operators in the mothership guided the B-17 towards its target, they fought a constant battle with the sluggish controls and the poor visibility. The drone began its descent, a silent, purposeful glide towards the massive concrete pens. It was a moment of supreme tension, the culmination of weeks of preparation and terrible sacrifice. And then, it missed. The B-17, flying blind and dumb, struck the water several hundred yards from the edge of the complex. The impact triggered the fuses. The North Sea erupted in a colossal geyser of white water and smoke, a display of raw power that shook the island but left the U-boat pens utterly unscathed. The concrete monsters had survived again, this time not through their own strength, but through the clumsy delivery of their would-be destroyer. Back at Fur's Field, the report was met with frustration. They had overcome the first, fatal hurdle, the drone had not killed its crew on takeoff. But they had failed the second, hitting the target. The weapon was too crude, the guidance too primitive. It was a sledgehammer trying to perform the work of a scalpel. Yet, they had no scalpel. And so, they prepared to try again. The target was shifted back to the cross-channel gun batteries in France. The engineers made more adjustments, the crews underwent more drills. The cycle of hope, fear, and failure was establishing its own brutal rhythm. Operation Aphrodite was learning to walk, but its steps were clumsy, destructive, and drenched in the ever-present scent of cordite and tragedy. If flying the drone was a calculated gamble with death, then controlling it from the mothership was a unique form of psychological torture. The mothership, typically a battle-weary B-24 Liberator, was a cramped, noisy nerve center packed with a bizarre amalgamation of standard flight controls and experimental radio equipment. Its crew consisted of the pilots flying the B-24 itself, and the all-important, drone controllers, officers and technicians who were now pioneers in the world of remote-controlled warfare. Their workspace was a tangle of wires, oscilloscopes, and large, ungainly radio boxes, their eyes glued to a small, flickering video screen that received a signal from a camera mounted in the drone's nose. This was their window into the mission, a blurry, gray, and often staticky view of the sky and, hopefully, the target. The controller's tool was a simple joystick, connected to a radio transmitter that sent signals to the actuators in the drone's control surfaces. The lag was significant, the response sluggish. Guiding the 20,000-pound explosive-laden B-17 was not like flying a responsive fighter, it was like trying to steer a flying barge through molasses, with a several-second delay between command and reaction. The psychological pressure on these men was immense. They were not just operating a machine, they were shepherding the final, explosive journey of an aircraft that, just minutes before, had been flown by their comrades. The success of the mission, the lives risked by the jump crew, and the immense destructive potential of the weapon all rested on their skill and the fragile, unreliable radio link. The first sign of trouble was usually the video feed. It would break up into swirling patterns of static, or simply freeze on a single, useless frame. The radio control link was equally vulnerable. A German radio station broadcasting on a nearby frequency, atmospheric conditions, or simple equipment failure could sever their control in an instant. When this happened, a cold dread would fill the mothership. The drone was now a rogue agent, a 10-ton unguided missile with a one-track mind, flying on its last autopilot setting until it ran out of fuel or hit something. The controllers would frantically switch frequencies, reboot systems, their voices tense over the intercom as they tried to re-establish the link, to regain control of the beast before it wandered into a neutral country or, worse, turned back towards England. One such mission against a V-2 rocket site in the Netherlands went horribly wrong. The drone, AB-17 packed with Torpex, was successfully launched and its crew bailed out safely. The mothership took control and began guiding it across the channel. Then, over the Dutch coast, the video feed dissolved into snow. The radio link was lost. The controllers fought for minutes, their hands sweating on the equipment, but the link was gone. The drone, now a ghost, continued on its last heading, flying deeper into occupied territory. It eventually crashed, unexploded, in a field. German troops swarmed the wreckage. The intelligence coup for the Nazis was immense. They now had their hands on the intact, revolutionary, if flawed, American drone technology, and, more alarmingly, they had 20,000 pounds of Torpex to analyze. For the Aphrodite team, it was a catastrophic security breach. The Germans now knew their secret, and understood the desperate lengths the Allies are going to. The pressure on the mothership crews intensified. They couldn't just hit the target, they had to ensure the drone didn't fall into enemy hands. This sometimes meant making a terrible choice. If the drone went rogue and was heading for a populated area or risked capture, the mothership had a command to detonate it in mid-air. They carried the burden of being the ones to trigger that cataclysm, potentially killing civilians or sacrificing the mission to protect its secrets. Every moment of the control phase was a high-wire act. As the drone began its final dive towards the target, the controller's job became one of fine-tuning. The screen would show the target growing larger, a blurry mess of concrete and landscape. He had to fight the drone's tendency to porpoise, to correct for wind drift, all through a grainy, lagging image. It was an almost impossible task. A miss by a few hundred yards, as seen in the Heligoland mission, was considered a failure, rendering the awesome explosive power useless. The motherships returned from these missions not with the triumphant fatigue of a successful bomber crew, but with the hollow, strained exhaustion of men who had carried an unbearable responsibility and, more often than not, watched it end in failure or disaster. They were the unseen architects of a new kind of warfare, and the weight of its imperfections was slowly crushing them. The target was finally in sight. After the failures over Heligoland and the disastrous loss of a drone to the Germans, the Aphrodite team was hungry for a win. The chosen objective was a complex of reinforced concrete V-2 rocket launch sites in northern France, a target that was both tactically vital and symbolically potent. The launch of a new drone, call sign Gremlin Gus, proceeded with the now familiar ritual of terror. The volunteer crew, their faces set in masks of grim concentration, took the overloaded B-17 into the sky. The arming sequence, a nerve-shredding series of switches and checks, was completed without a catastrophic short circuit. A collective, silent sigh of relief was breathed by all monitoring the mission. The crew then performed their escape, bailing out over the English Channel to be fished out by a waiting rescue boat. Now, it was the mothership's turn. The drone controllers, their hands steady but their hearts racing, took control of Gremlin Gus. The grainy video feed from the drone's nose camera showed the French coastline approaching. The controller guided the aircraft inland, following pre-planned waypoints. The mission was proceeding with an unnerving smoothness. As the V-2 site came into view on the screen, a collection of low, camouflaged buildings and concrete pads, the controller initiated the final attack sequence. He pushed the joystick forward, commanding the drone into its terminal dive. The image on the screen shifted, the ground rushing up in a blur of green and gray. The controller fought to keep the crosshairs centered on the heart of the complex, compensating for the drone's sluggish response. It was a battle of wills between man and machine, fought over a crackling radio link. The drone descended, a silent, purposeful angel of death. At the last moment, the video feed dissolved into a storm of static, the inevitable result of the intense vibrations and the low altitude. The controller held the stick in position, praying the command signal was still getting through. And then, the screen went completely black. Seconds later, a violent shockwave rattled the mothership, miles away. On the ground, the result was apocalyptic. The 20,000-pound Torpex charge detonated at the very edge of the V-2 complex. The explosion was not a fireball, but a massive, instantaneous displacement of earth and concrete. A crater over 100 feet wide was scooped out of the French soil. The concrete launch pads were shattered like glass. Support buildings simply vanished. The shockwave rolled outwards, flattening trees and tossing vehicles like toys. For the first time, an Aphrodite drone had not only reached its target but had struck close enough to matter. The damage assessment, conducted later by reconnaissance planes, showed near total destruction of the launch site. It was a success. A costly, horrifying, but undeniable success. Back at RAF Furs Field, the mood was not celebratory, but somber. They had proven the concept. They had harnessed unimaginable destructive power and delivered it, however clumsily, onto a hardened target. But the cost was etched on every face. The memory of Kennedy's vaporization, the stress of the control cruise, the sheer terror of the jump cruise, it all hung in the air, a heavy price for this single victory. The engineers and strategists now faced a new, uncomfortable reality. Aphrodite worked. But was it a weapon they could, or should, continue to use? The tactical value was clear, but the human and material cost was staggering. Each mission risked not only the lives of the crews but also the loss of a valuable B-17 airframe and 20,000 pounds of high explosives. It was the bluntest of instruments in a war that was increasingly demanding precision. The success of Gremlin Gus had opened a door, but the path ahead was darker and more morally complex than anyone had imagined. While the U.S. Army Air Forces wrestled with the moral and practical implications of their flying bombs, the U.S. Navy was watching with keen interest. They faced a threat even more formidable than concrete bunkers, the German battleship Tirpitz. The sister ship of the infamous Bismarck, the Tirpitz was a behemoth lurking in the Norwegian fjords, a fleet in being, whose mere existence tied down a significant portion of the British Royal Navy. Conventional attacks by Royal Navy midget submarines and Fleet Air Arm bombers had damaged her, but none had delivered the killing blow. The sheer scale of the ship's armor made her nearly invulnerable to standard aerial bombs. The Navy saw in Aphrodite a potential solution of audacious proportions. If a B-17 could be turned into a massive bomb, why not a larger, more powerful aircraft? The Navy selected the PB-4Y-1, the naval version of the B-24 Liberator. The plan, designated Operation Anvil, was a mirror of Aphrodite but on a grander, even more dangerous scale. The modifications were the same: strip the aircraft, pack it with Torpex, install remote controls. But the mission profile was infinitely more hazardous. The Tirpitz was anchored in a narrow, heavily defended fjord, surrounded by flak batteries and protected by torpedo nets. A slow, predictable drone would be a sitting duck. The first and only Anvil mission was launched on September 3, 1944, from an airfield in Scotland. The crew consisted of two men, Lieutenant Joseph P. Kennedy Jr.'s former roommate, Lieutenant Wilford Bud Willie, and Lieutenant Joseph M. Harvey. Their target was the Tirpitz, hidden deep within a Norwegian fjord. The mission was a gamble from the start. The longer flight over the North Sea tested the range of the fragile radio control link. The weather was deteriorating. And the German defenses around the Tirpitz were the most concentrated in all of Europe. The takeoff was successful. Willie and Harvey flew the laden PB-4Y towards the Norwegian coast. They began the arming sequence. What happened next was a grim echo of the Kennedy disaster. As they toggled the switches to arm the colossal 12-ton Torpex payload, a catastrophic electrical fault occurred. The official report would again cite a short circuit in the arming mechanism. The result was the same. Just off the coast of Scotland, the PB-4Y-1 vanished in a blinding flash, instantly killing Willie and Harvey and vaporizing the aircraft and its payload. The explosion was so massive it was heard 50 miles away. The Navy's foray into drone bombing had ended before it even reached enemy territory, claiming 2 more lives in an identical, preventable tragedy. The double catastrophe of Kennedy and Willie Harvey, both caused by the same fundamental flaw in the arming system, cast a long, dark shadow over the entire program. It was now irrefutable, the technology for safely controlling these flying bombs was not just primitive. It was fundamentally unsafe for the men tasked with launching them. The Navy immediately cancelled Operation Anvil. The Tirpitz would eventually be sunk by the RAF using another type of massive, specially designed, tallboy bomb. The failure of Anvil was a turning point. It demonstrated that the risks of Aphrodite were not isolated to one service or one airframe. The problem was inherent to the concept itself. The dream of a remotely piloted, precision-guided superweapon was, for now, a nightmare of fire and loss. The question was no longer if they could make it work, but if they should even try again. Despite the tragedies, the war ground on, and the pressure to use every available weapon remained. The Aphrodite program, now stained with the blood of 2 naval aviators, was scaled back but not abandoned. The Army Air Forces launched a handful more missions throughout the autumn of 1944. The targets were the same hardened, high-value objectives that had eluded conventional bombing, the U-boat pens at Heligoland, the chemical works in Germany, and more V-weapon sites. The results were a frustratingly mixed bag, a testament to the program's inherent inconsistency. One mission against an industrial target in Germany was a spectacular, if terrifying, success. The drone, guided with unexpected precision by its mothership, plunged directly into the heart of a large factory complex. The detonation of its Torpex payload was so complete that it not only leveled the primary target but also caused secondary explosions in adjacent facilities, creating a firestorm that burned for days. Reconnaissance photos showed a smoldering scar where the factory once stood. It was the ultimate realization of the Aphrodite concept, total, localized annihilation. Yet, for every such success, there were 2 more failures. Another drone, aimed at a V-1 launch site, suffered a radio failure just minutes from its target. The mothership crew watched in helpless frustration as the B-17 continued on a straight course, flying aimlessly over occupied Europe until it presumably ran out of fuel and crashed, its explosive cargo either detonating harmlessly in a field or, worse, being recovered by the Germans. Yet another was successfully guided to its target, a massive concrete communications bunker, only to strike the ground a mere 50 yards from the structure. The explosion was immense, shaking the ground for miles and deafening the German garrison, but when the dust settled, the bunker stood, its thick walls scarred but structurally intact. 50 yards was, for the purposes of this weapon, a miss. These failures highlighted the program's greatest weakness: the guidance system was simply not accurate enough to justify the immense risk and cost. It was a weapon of area destruction trying to perform a precision strike. The war-weary B-17s, chosen for their expendability, were now becoming a scarce resource themselves. The Allied advance in Europe was liberating airfields, and the steady supply of battered bombers that needed to be disposed of was drying up. The program was dying, not with a bang, but with a slow, grinding whimper of missed targets, technical failures, and a growing consensus among high command that there had to be a better way. The men involved, from the ground crews to the controllers, felt the shift. The initial, desperate energy that had launched Aphrodite was gone, replaced by a weary sense of obligation. They were going through the motions, launching these terrible weapons because the order existed, not because anyone truly believed in them anymore. Each successful bailout was met with relief, not triumph. Each explosion was noted with clinical detachment. The soul had gone out of the endeavor, leaving only the hollow, mechanical shell of a failed dream. The final Aphrodite mission was launched in early January 1945. It was, like so many before it, a failure. The drone was lost over the North Sea, its fate unknown. There was no official announcement, no ceremony to mark the end. The program was simply quietly terminated. The remaining converted drones were stripped of their explosives and scrapped. The special hangars at RAF Furs Field were returned to their original use. The motherships were reconfigured for more conventional duties. Operation Aphrodite was over. It had lasted for 6 months, cost the lives of several airmen, consumed countless man-hours and vast resources, and in the end, had produced no decisive effect on the outcome of the war. It was a footnote, a tragic and expensive experiment born from desperation and extinguished by its own inherent flaws. In the cold light of the post-war analysis, Operation Aphrodite was dissected with brutal honesty. On paper, it was a catastrophic failure. The program had consumed valuable aircraft, vast quantities of high explosives, and, most importantly, the lives of brave men for a minimal return on investment. The list of successfully destroyed targets was pitifully short when weighed against the cost. The fundamental flaws were clear: the arming system was lethally unsafe, the guidance technology was hopelessly inadequate, and the entire concept was a product of a specific, desperate moment in the war that had quickly passed. The technological leap required to make it viable: reliable remote control, stable video transmission, precise navigation, was simply beyond the capabilities of 1944. Aphrodite was an idea ahead of its time, and the men involved paid the price for that premature ambition. Yet, to dismiss it entirely as a failure is to miss its true, darker significance. Aphrodite was the bloody, violent cradle of modern unmanned warfare. Every Reaper drone that circles over a battlefield today, controlled by a pilot sitting thousands of miles away, has a direct, if ugly, lineage back to the jerry-rigged B-17s of RAF Furs Field. The problems the Aphrodite engineers faced, maintaining a secure data link, processing a live video feed, guiding an unmanned vehicle to a precise point, are the very same problems that define aerospace engineering in the 21st century. They were the first to grapple with the moral and tactical questions of remote-controlled war. What is the psychological burden on the controller? What happens when the link is lost? How do you ensure the discriminate use of such an indiscriminate weapon? Aphrodite asked these questions in the most brutal way possible, and provided no easy answers. For the families of the fallen, like the Kennedys, the program was a personal tragedy that reverberated through history. The death of Joe Jr. fundamentally altered the family's destiny, placing the weight of its political ambitions onto the shoulders of his younger brother, John F. Kennedy. The personal cost of this military experiment was immeasurable and echoes through the decades. For the survivors, the pilots and controllers who lived through the program, it was a chapter of their lives they often tried to forget. They had participated in something that felt, even at the time, unnaturally cold and detached, a perversion of the airman's creed. They had not flown against an enemy in a duel of skill and courage, they had been technicians in a suicidal engineering test. There was no glory in Aphrodite, only relief at having survived it. The official records were sealed, the program faded from public memory, overshadowed by the war's larger narratives. It became a curious, dark secret of the war, a what-if scenario discussed only in hushed tones by aviation historians and military strategists. The men of Aphrodite were not celebrated as heroes. They were remembered as casualties of a failed experiment. Their legacy was not one of victory, but of a grim, necessary lesson written in fire and steel. The path to the future of warfare is often paved with the wreckage of good intentions and terrible sacrifices. The physical legacy of Operation Aphrodite is one of silence and absence. The massive craters in the French and Dutch countryside have long since been filled in or have become overgrown, nature slowly healing the scars of the war. The specific bunkers they failed to destroy were eventually neutralized by advancing Allied troops or fell into disuse. There are no monuments at RAF Furs Field to the men who flew the drones. The airfield itself was largely returned to agricultural use, the concrete runways broken up, the memory of the secret missions fading with each passing year. The technological legacy, however, is anything but silent. The lessons learned from the repeated failures of the radio control and television guidance systems were studied intensely in the post-war years. The engineers who had worked on Aphrodite went on to work on new projects for the burgeoning Cold War. Their knowledge of the challenges of remote flight was invaluable. The development of cruise missiles, target drones, and eventually, reconnaissance drones like the Lockheed U-2, all benefited from the hard-won, tragic data of Aphrodite. The program proved that the concept of an unmanned combat vehicle was possible, even if their execution was fatally flawed. It provided a proof of concept, however bloody, that helped convince a skeptical military establishment to continue investing in the technology. This research would eventually culminate in the sophisticated unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, of today. The modern MQ-9 Reaper, carrying its precision Hellfire missiles, is the spiritual and technological successor to the Torpex-laden B-17. But the key difference is precision. Aphrodite was a sledgehammer, modern drones are scalpels. The evolution from a 20,000-pound area bomb to a missile that can strike a single room in a building represents the fulfillment of the original Aphrodite goal, to deliver overwhelming force onto a single, pinpoint target, without risking a pilot's life. The program also left a deep ethical legacy. It was one of the first times the military had grappled with the concept of a mission where the primary risk was not in combat, but in the act of launching the weapon itself. It blurred the lines between a soldier's sacrifice and a technician's accident. The psychological profile of the drone pilot, in the mothership, stressed and detached, prefigured the experiences of modern UAV operators. Aphrodite was the beginning of a fundamental shift in the very nature of warfare, a shift towards automation, remote control, and a new kind of battlefield stress. For the men who were there, the legacy was personal and often painful. Many suffered from what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, not from dogfights, but from the constant, grinding fear of a technological failure that would vaporize them, or the burden of guiding a flying bomb to its target. They were pioneers in a field that had no name, veterans of a secret war that nobody knew about, carrying their memories in silence for the rest of their lives. Operation Aphrodite stands as a stark monument to human ingenuity and human fallibility. It was a desperate gamble that failed in its immediate objectives but succeeded in inadvertently charting the course for the future. It is a story not of glory, but of lessons learned the hard way. A story written not in victory telegrams, but in after-action reports analyzing why things went so terribly, tragically wrong. So, what is the final verdict on Operation Aphrodite? History's judgment is complex. In the strictest military sense, it was an expensive and tragic failure. It failed to neutralize its primary targets with any consistency, it claimed the lives of highly trained airmen through technical malfunctions rather than enemy action, and it consumed resources that could have been used elsewhere. It stands as a cautionary tale about the dangers of pursuing technological solutions that are beyond the current state of the art, and about the human cost of desperation. Yet, to consign it purely to the dustbin of failed military experiments is to misunderstand its profound impact. Aphrodite was a seed planted in the toxic soil of total war. It was ugly, it was malformed, and it bore bitter fruit. But it was a seed nonetheless. From its wreckage grew the entire field of unmanned combat aviation. The men who conceived of it were visionaries, even if their vision was ahead of their ability to realize it. They looked at an impossible problem, the impregnable fortress, and conceived of an impossible solution, the robotic bomber. They failed not for lack of courage or intellect, but because the tools they needed were still a half-century away. The story of Aphrodite is not one of triumph, but of transition. It marks the moment when warfare began its slow, inexorable shift from the visceral, personal combat of the past towards the detached, technological conflict of the future. It asked the question, what if the pilot didn't need to be in the plane? It was a heresy against the very ethos of the airman, and it paid the price for that heresy. But the question itself refused to die. Today, as unmanned systems fill the skies over battlefields across the globe, the ghost of Aphrodite flies with them. The echoes of the mothership controller's tense voice can be heard in the calm, focused commands of a drone pilot in Nevada. The explosive potential of 10 tons of Torpex is now concentrated into the precise fury of a Hellfire missile. The program's greatest legacy is the path it blazed, a path paved with the sacrifice of men like Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., Wilford John, Bud Willie, and Joseph Harvey. They did not die to win a battle, but to test a concept. Theirs is a different kind of valor, one born not in the heat of combat, but in the cold calculus of the laboratory and the proving ground. It is a valor that is harder to celebrate, but no less worthy of remembrance. Operation Aphrodite serves as an eternal reminder that progress, especially in the deadly business of war, is never free. It is paid for in blood and tragedy. The sleek, silent drones of the 21st century are the descendants of the clumsy, roaring B-17s of Aphrodite, and they carry with them the memory of the program's ambition, its failure, and its sacrifice. The story of these first, tragic flying bombs is not just a footnote in history. It is the prologue to our present, a dark and necessary chapter in the chronicle of how we fight, and a sobering lesson in the price of innovation.